My brother Vincent passed away and left the sprawling Silver Creek Ranch in my name. When my family, who had abandoned me 12 years ago, found out about the multi-million-dollar estate, they knocked on my door. Valerie, my estranged son's wife, dropped her designer bags onto the hardwood floor and smirked. "Hi, father-in-law. We came to live in the master suite. You can keep the barn," she said. At that moment, I stood my ground, looked straight into her greedy eyes, and said the 5 words that froze them completely. "You own absolutely nothing here." Their triumphant smiles vanished, yet their arrogance blinded them to the reality that they had just walked into a perfectly orchestrated meat grinder. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The wind sweeping across the Montana Valley carried the sharp scent of pine and freshly turned earth. I stood alone beside the open grave of my older brother Vincent. For 2 decades, he had been my only anchor in a world that had otherwise entirely discarded me. The pastor had finished his final prayer, leaving me in the heavy, suffocating silence of the cemetery. I held a handful of dry dirt, feeling the coarse grains bite into my calloused palms before letting it fall onto the simple pine casket. I did not cry. Tears belong to those who have the luxury of mourning in peace. I was already bracing for a different kind of storm. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel shattered the stillness of the afternoon. A sleek, black luxury SUV roared past the wrought iron gates of the cemetery and parked carelessly over the grass. The engine died, and the heavy door swung open. Aaron stepped out. My only son. The boy I had raised with every ounce of my sweat and blood. I had not seen his face in 12 years. He did not walk toward the grave to offer a prayer. He did not look at me with any trace of sympathy. His eyes immediately swept across the rolling hills of the Silver Creek Ranch, visible in the distance, calculating the acreage, weighing the timber, assessing the water rights. He walked toward me, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. He looked down at his feet with an expression of profound disgust. He kicked the side of his shoe against a gravestone, complaining loudly that the rural dust was ruining his imported Italian leather shoes. That single arrogant gesture ripped open a wound I had kept sealed for over a decade. The dust on his shoes perfectly mirrored the dust settling in the empty living room of my foreclosed house 12 years ago. My construction business had collapsed under the weight of an economic recession. I had lost everything to pay for his college tuition, ensuring he graduated debt-free. On the day the bank sent the eviction notice, Aaron packed his bags, looked at my ruined life, and told me I was a dead weight dragging down his future. He slammed the door and vanished into the city, leaving me to face bankruptcy and homelessness alone. Vincent took me in, gave me a job on his ranch, and helped me rebuild my dignity piece by piece. Now Aaron stood before me, drawn back not by love or grief, but by the scent of a multi-million-dollar estate without a clear air in his mind. He stopped 2 feet away from me. He offered no embrace. He simply extended his hand, palm up, with a demanding glare. "Hand over the keys to the main house," he ordered, his voice dripping with authority. He spoke to me as if I were a hired hand, a temporary groundskeeper trespassing on his newfound kingdom. He assumed that because I had failed financially in the past, Vincent would have never entrusted me with the estate. Aaron believed he was the natural successor, the educated businessman stepping in to claim his rightful throne. He expected me to argue. He wanted a fight so he could assert his dominance. I gave him nothing. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the heavy brass ring holding the keys to the guest wing, and dropped them into his open palm. His fingers closed around the metal with a greedy snap. A smug smile twisted his lips. He turned his back on me and walked to his leased vehicle without a word of thanks. I stood by the grave and watched him drive toward the ranch. He thought my silence was surrender. He did not realize I had just handed him the rope he would use to hang himself. I arrived at the main house an hour later to a scene of absolute desecration. Valerie had arrived. My daughter-in-law stood on the front porch, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the historic wood. She was directing two men she had hired to clear out the house. I watched as the front door swung open, and Vincent's belongings were hurled onto the lawn like contaminated waste. A heavy thud shook the ground as Vincent's hand-tooled leather saddle struck the dirt, the intricate floral carvings scraping against the gravel. A box of vintage vinyl records followed, bursting open upon impact, scattering shattered black fragments across the grass. Valerie stood with her hands on her hips, her face contorted in a sneer. She complained loudly to her husband about the suffocating stench of old men permeating the walls. She declared that every piece of rustic furniture had to be burned to make room for her modern minimalist decor. I stepped onto the driveway. Valerie noticed me and did not flinch. She pointed a manicured finger at a pile of heavy designer luggage resting by the trunk of her car. She commanded me to carry her bags into the house, instructing me to use the back entrance so I would not track mud onto the rugs she planned to install. Aaron leaned against the doorframe, watching me with a cold, challenging stare. They were testing the waters, pushing my boundaries to see how much humiliation I would endure before breaking. I walked past the luggage. I ignored her demands. I knelt in the dirt and carefully picked up Vincent's ruined saddle, brushing the gravel from the leather. I gathered the broken pieces of his records. I carried these remnants of my brother's life toward the large barn at the edge of the property. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand respect. I simply removed myself from their immediate path. My compliance acted as a powerful catalyst for their arrogance. Back in the main house, Aaron interpreted my retreat as a total abdication of my rights. Standing in the shadow of the barn doors, I listened as Aaron made a loud phone call from the back patio. He was speaking to a prominent commercial real estate developer in the city. He boasted about his newly acquired asset, describing Silver Creek not as a working ranch, but as a prime location for a luxury resort and golf course. He promised the developer that the land was entirely unencumbered and ready for immediate sale. The stakes instantly shifted. This was no longer just a personal insult from a greedy son. This was a direct existential threat to the legacy Vincent had spent his entire life building. Aaron intended to pave over decades of sweat history and agricultural heritage for a quick cash payout. I walked into the dark, cavernous space of the barn, locking the heavy wooden doors behind me. I set the saddle down on a workbench. The air was thick with the smell of hay and motor oil. I knew what I had to do. The time for grieving was over. The time for war had begun. Night descended over the Montana Valley, bringing a biting chill that penetrated the wooden walls of the barn. From the main house, the blinding glare of floodlights cut through the darkness. Aaron and Valerie wasted no time cementing their claim. They had invited a dozen of their wealthy city friends to a lavish dinner party to showcase their new kingdom. The heavy rhythmic thumping of club music echoed across the silent fields, a vulgar intrusion into the sanctuary of the ranch. I sat in the darkness of the barn, watching through a narrow window. Luxury cars were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawns. Intoxicated guests stumbled through the carefully curated gardens Vincent had tended to for 15 years. I watched a woman in stiletto heels trample directly over the rare blue roses my brother had cultivated, snapping the stems without a second thought. Laughter and shattering glass rang out into the night. They were celebrating the death of my brother. They were feasting on a corpse. Inside the barn, the environment was entirely different from the rustic exterior. Vincent had been a traditional rancher, but he was also a man who understood the value of security. The back half of the barn housed a reinforced climate-controlled room that served as the true operational heart of Silver Creek. I sat in a leather chair facing a bank of glowing monitors. High-definition security feeds covered every inch of the property, hidden seamlessly within the architecture of the main house and the surrounding outbuildings. I watched the party unfold on the screens. Aaron was holding court in the massive living room, pouring expensive champagne, loudly mocking the rural lifestyle of the man whose house he was currently desecrating. As the night wore on, the alcohol supply began to run dry. I watched the camera feed in the main hallway as Aaron, flushed and visibly intoxicated, marched toward the locked door of Vincent's private study. I knew exactly what was inside. Vincent housed a collection of vintage, incredibly rare wines in a climate-controlled vault behind that door. Aaron rattled the heavy brass handle. Finding it locked, he grew furious. He viewed the locked door as a personal insult, a barrier to his absolute authority. He stormed away from the camera's view and returned moments later holding a heavy steel fire axe from the garage. He raised the axe and swung it with brutal force into the solid oak door. The heavy thud of metal splintering wood echoed through the house, sending a shockwave of adrenaline through my veins. He swung again and again, shattering the lock and kicking the door open. He marched into the study, grabbing bottles of wine worth thousands of dollars, completely unaware of the tripwire he had just crossed. The moment the lock shattered, a silent alarm triggered in the barn. A red light flashed across my control monitors, signaling a critical breach of the inner sanctum. Aaron thought he was merely breaking a door to steal some wine. In reality, he had just committed documented vandalism and theft. He had provided me with the first irrefutable piece of evidence I needed to dismantle his life. The physical destruction of the door marked the official end of my passive observation. I reached forward and engaged the secondary security protocols linking the video feeds directly to my secure cloud server. I watched my son laugh as he uncorked a bottle of stolen wine surrounded by strangers in a house he did not own. He was celebrating a victory that did not exist. He was a vulture feasting on a trap. I leaned back in the chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows across the barn. The game was set. The evidence was recording. The illusion of his power was absolute, and I was going to let him build his kingdom of sand as high as possible before I summoned the tide to wash it all away. The morning sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains, casting long golden shadows across the dew-soaked grass of Silver Creek. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of pine needles and damp soil, a sharp contrast to the sour stench of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and trampled flowers left behind by my son and his friends. I had spent the night in the barn, sitting upright in a worn leather chair, listening to the destruction of my brother's sanctuary. Now the silence of the dawn was broken by the sharp, violent thud of heavy objects hitting the wooden floorboards of the main house porch. I walked out of the barn, my boots crunching rhythmically against the gravel driveway. There, standing on the wraparound porch Vincent had built with his own 2 hands, was Valerie. She was wearing a silk robe that dragged carelessly across the dusty planks, a cup of steaming coffee in one hand. With her free hand, she pushed the heavy oak front door wide open. Then she raised her foot and kicked. My heavy leather work boots, the ones I had left neatly by the threshold for the past 12 years, tumbled down the wooden steps and landed in the dirt. They were covered in mud and grease, bearing the scars of countless hours spent repairing fences and mending roofs. To me, they were a testament to survival. To her, they were garbage. I kept my pace steady. I did not rush. I did not show anger. A man who has lost everything once does not easily surrender his composure a second time. I reached the bottom of the steps and looked down at the boots. The leather was scuffed, the laces frayed. They looked exactly like I felt, worn down by years of carrying burdens that were not entirely my own. Valerie took a slow sip of her coffee, looking down at me with an expression that barely concealed her utter contempt. She did not see a 65-year-old man who had worked his fingers to the bone. She saw an obstacle, an eyesore, a squatter on a property she had already claimed in her mind. Aaron appeared in the doorway behind her. He wore a crisp white shirt, looking entirely too rested for a man who had spent the previous night smashing open his dead uncle's wine cellar with a fire axe. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest, offering no greeting, no apology for his wife's actions. He simply watched, letting Valerie handle the dirty work of exterminating my presence from the main house. "We need to talk about living arrangements," Valerie announced. Her voice sliced through the crisp morning air, sharp and unyielding. It was not a request. It was an eviction notice delivered over morning coffee. Aaron and I have been discussing the future of this property. The main house is simply too large for one person, especially a person who spends his days covered in grease and horse manure. She gestured vaguely toward the sprawling pastures behind me. We are planning to start a family soon. A child needs space, clean air, a proper environment. The master suite is the only room with the right natural lighting for a nursery. We have already contacted an interior designer in the city to start drawing up renovation plans. I remained silent, looking up at her from the bottom of the steps. The master suite had been Vincent's room. His clothes still hung in the closet. His books still sat on the nightstand. He had been dead for less than a week, and these two vultures were already picking the flesh from his bones, eager to paint over his memory with pastel colors and expensive cribs. You will need to move your remaining things out by the end of the weekend. Valerie continued, her tone brisk and efficient like a manager firing a subordinate. The barn is completely insulated, isn't it? We saw a cot back there near the server room. That should be more than enough space for you. You can set up a nice little living area out there out of the way. It makes sense functionally speaking. You belong with the equipment, not in the main house. I looked from Valerie to Aaron, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy whose college tuition had drained my savings. I waited for him to speak, to intervene, to show a single shred of the decency I had tried to instill in him. He simply averted his gaze, staring out at the distant tree line. He was letting his wife do the butchering so his hands could remain clean. When I did not immediately agree to pack my life into a dusty corner of the barn, Valerie scoffed. The mask of polite efficiency dropped, revealing the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. "Don't look at us like that," she snapped, stepping closer to the edge of the porch. "You should be grateful we are letting you stay on the property at all. Let us be brutally honest here. You are not capable of managing an estate of this magnitude. You do not have the business acumen to run Silver Creek." She paused, letting a cruel, satisfied smile spread across her face. "Aaron told me all about your little construction business, how you drove it straight into the ground 12 years ago. You went bankrupt. You lost your home. You lost everything because you do not know how to manage money. You are a financial failure. If Vincent had not taken pity on you and given you a job mucking out stalls, you would be living on the street right now." The words hit exactly where she intended them to. They struck the old, deep scar of my greatest failure. But she had the story wrong. I did not go bankrupt because I was incompetent. I went bankrupt because I liquidated every asset I had, took out predatory loans, and drained my retirement accounts to pay off Aaron's massive gambling debts before he graduated college, ensuring he would not start his adult life in a prison cell. I lost my home to save his future. And on the day the bank locked the doors to my house, Aaron had packed his bags, called me a failure, and walked away without looking back. Now his wife was using the very sacrifice that had saved him as proof of my incompetence. Aaron shifted uncomfortably against the doorframe, but he did not correct her. He let the lie stand. He preferred to be married to a woman who thought his father was an idiot than to admit he was a parasite. "We are doing you a favor," Valerie concluded, taking another sip of her coffee. "Aaron is an educated businessman. He knows how to maximize the profits of this land. We will take over the administration of the ranch. You can stay in the barn, keep the fences mended, and live out your days in peace. It is the best arrangement for everyone. Now please pick up your dirty boots and start clearing out the master bathroom. The designer is coming at noon." The silence that followed her monologue was absolute. The wind seemed to die down. The birds stopped singing in the pines. The entire world held its breath, waiting for my reaction. I looked down at my battered boots lying in the dirt. I slowly bent my knees, the joints popping in the quiet air, and picked them up. I dusted the loose soil from the leather, holding them firmly in my left hand. Then I straightened my posture. I looked past Valerie. I looked directly into Aaron's eyes. I saw the brief flicker of fear hiding behind his arrogance. He knew me. He knew I was not a man who surrendered without cause. I walked up the first step, then the second. I did not stop until I was standing on the porch, inches away from Valerie. She took a reflexive step backward, her coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug and burning her fingers. She gasped, dropping the mug. It shattered against the wooden planks, sending dark liquid pooling around my boots. I did not blink. I stared into her greedy, widened eyes, letting the full weight of my presence press down on her. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that cut straight to the bone. You own absolutely nothing here. The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. Valerie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute certainty in my voice paralyzed her. For a fraction of a second, the illusion of her power vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that she was standing on soil she could not control. Then the shock warped into explosive, violent outrage. Her face flushed crimson. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You insolent old fool! This is Aaron's inheritance. You are nothing but a squatter. I want you off this property today. I will call the sheriff. I will have you dragged out of here in handcuffs." Her shrieking broke Aaron from his silent observation. The threat to his authority, the embarrassment of his wife being defied by the man he had cast aside, ignited his temper. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. His face was contorted with a vicious, ugly rage. He raised his hands and shoved me hard against the chest. The force of the blow sent me stumbling backward. My spine slammed violently against the wooden railing of the porch. Pain flared across my shoulders, taking the breath from my lungs. The wood groaned under my weight, bending but holding firm. I gripped the railing with my free hand, steadying myself as my boots gripped the floorboards. Aaron stood over me, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He had crossed the final boundary. The verbal disrespect had escalated into physical violence. The war was no longer simmering beneath the surface. It was here, standing on the porch of the home my brother built, demanding blood. I looked at the man who had just assaulted his own father. I did not retaliate. I did not strike back. I simply looked at him and smiled. It was a cold, hollow smile that carried no joy, only the absolute certainty of his impending destruction. He had just handed me the final justification I needed to strip him of everything. The dull ache in my spine from striking the porch railing served as a constant physical reminder of my son's absolute moral decay. I did not rub my shoulder. I did not show weakness. I left Aaron standing there on the wooden deck, breathless and furious, and made my way down the gravel path toward the stables. The air inside the large barn was thick with the honest scent of sweet alfalfa, old leather, and damp earth. It was a place of relentless work, a sanctuary built on sweat and integrity that men like Aaron would never understand. I picked up a heavy pitchfork and began clearing the stalls. Physical labor is the best remedy for the poison of betrayal. It clears the mind. It sharpens the focus. I knew Aaron would not let my defiance go unpunished. His ego was a fragile, bloated thing. Striking me was just the beginning. He needed to prove he was the absolute master of Silver Creek. He needed to break me legally, completely, and permanently. It took him less than 3 hours to formulate his next desperate move. The aggressive crunch of tires on the dirt road signaled their approach. Aaron did not come alone. He marched into the dim, dusty light of the stables with a stranger trailing anxiously behind him. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, sensing the sudden influx of hostile energy. The man accompanying my son was short, sweating profusely, despite the cool mountain air, and wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He clutched a black leather briefcase tight against his chest, as if he expected the shadows themselves to reach out and steal it. This was not a respectable estate lawyer. This was a man you hired from the back pages of a local phone book, someone whose moral compass could be adjusted for a few $100s in cash. A shady notary public brought in to legitimize a desperate crime. Aaron stopped a few feet in front of me. He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest, trying to project absolute authority. He wanted to look like a king surveying his conquered territory. Instead, he looked exactly like a panicked rat cornered in a trap. "Put the pitchfork down," Aaron commanded. His voice echoed off the high wooden beams, harsh and grating against the quiet rustle of the horses. "We have official business to conduct." I drove the steel tines of the pitchfork deep into a bale of hay and leaned my weight against the smooth wooden handle. I looked at the notary, who nervously adjusted his thick glasses and refused to meet my intense gaze. Then I looked at my son. "I have a stack of unpaid medical bills from Uncle Vincent's last days in the hospital." Aaron lied smoothly, his eyes cold and devoid of any genuine grief. "The hospital administration is threatening to put a massive lien on the property if we do not settle the outstanding accounts immediately. There are also complicated state tax liabilities that need to be cleared before the estate can be fully transitioned into my name." He snapped his fingers impatiently at the sweaty man beside him. The notary fumbled with the brass latches of his briefcase, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and a sleek black pen. Aaron snatched the heavy stack of papers and shoved them aggressively toward my chest. "I need your signature on this tax release form," he demanded. "Since your name is technically listed on some of the old caretaker manifests and utility bills, the county requires you to waive any financial liability. Sign it right now. We need to fax this to the hospital billing department before the close of business." I did not take the papers immediately. I looked at his hands. His knuckles were bone white. His fingers were trembling with a barely contained frantic energy. The sheer volume of his desperation was radiating off him like heat from a blast furnace. He was running out of time. "And what if I prefer to have my own lawyer read these pages first?" I asked, quietly, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Aaron stepped closer, invading my personal space, his face turning an ugly mottled shade of crimson. "You do not have a lawyer. You do not have a single dime to your name. If you do not sign this document right here and right now, I will drive my car straight to the county sheriff's office. I will tell the authorities you are a violent, unstable squatter who assaulted me on my own property. I will have you dragged out of this barn in handcuffs and thrown onto the highway. You will die with nothing. Sign the paper." I reached out and took the heavy stack of documents from his hands. I did not look at the signature line at the bottom. I started reading at the top of the very first page. The bold legal heading did not mention hospital medical bills. It did not mention state tax liabilities or caretaking waivers. It was a sweeping, unconditional, and irrevocable power of attorney. The document was expertly drafted to grant Aaron complete and absolute control over my personal finances, my assets, and any real estate property registered in my name. It gave him the unfettered legal authority to open bank accounts, secure massive lines of credit, and most importantly, use any property I owned as collateral for commercial loans. It was a masterpiece of legal theft. If I signed this paper, I would be handing him the keys to every single thing Vincent had entrusted to me. I would be giving him the power to dismantle Silver Creek piece by piece, selling off the timber, the water rights, and the very soil beneath our feet. I read the paragraphs, slowly absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his plan. He genuinely believed I was a broken, ignorant old man who would be too intimidated by the threat of law enforcement to read the fine print. He forgot that before I lost my wealth paying off his youthful debts, I ran a massive construction firm. I had spent decades reading complex commercial contracts. I knew exactly what I was looking at. He banked his entire future on my supposed cowardice. He needed this power of attorney because he knew deep down that he had no actual legal standing to sell or leverage the ranch on his own. The ruthless syndicate men were breathing down his neck, demanding their $2 million. He was drowning in an ocean of his own making, and this forged document was his only life raft. I looked up from the crisp white pages. Aaron was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, as he waited for my protest. He was braced for a bitter argument. He was ready to scream, to threaten me again, to pull out his phone and call the police. He wanted me to beg for mercy. Instead, I reached out and calmly took the black pen from the trembling notary's hand. I placed the thick stack of documents against the rough wooden post of the nearest horse stall. Without a single word of protest, without a hint of hesitation, I signed my full legal name on the dotted line. I flipped to the second page and signed again. I initialed the margins exactly where the predatory contract required. My handwriting was steady dark and perfectly legible. I handed the signed documents and the pen back to Aaron. His jaw slackened. The prepared threats died instantly in his throat. He looked down at the fresh ink, blinking in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He had expected a war. He had expected me to fight tooth and nail for the meager illusion of control over my life. My absolute instantaneous compliance completely short-circuited his brain. A slow, victorious smirk began to spread across his face. The tension drained from his rigid shoulders, replaced by a toxic, overwhelming arrogance. He believed he had finally broken my spirit. He believed the violent shove on the porch had terrified me into total, pathetic submission. He looked at the notary, nodding sharply. The sweaty man quickly stamped his heavy brass seal over my signatures, making the fraudulent document officially binding in the eyes of the law. Aaron snatched the papers back, clutching them against his chest, as if they were made of solid gold. "You finally did something smart, old man," Aaron sneered, his voice dripping with triumphant condescension. "Now stay out of my way. Do not speak to Valerie. Do not come near the main house." He turned on his heel and marched out of the stables, the notary practically jogging to keep up with his victorious stride. I stood in the cool shadows and watched them leave. Aaron did not even wait to reach his luxury vehicle before he pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket. I could hear his voice echoing clearly across the quiet dirt courtyard, loud and brimming with false, desperate confidence. He was not calling a hospital billing department. He was not calling a state tax attorney. He was calling a private, high-risk commercial lending firm in the city. The kind of predatory firm that provided massive, rapid cash loans at extortionate interest rates using major real estate holdings as collateral. He proudly announced to the loan officer on the other end of the line that he had full legally binding power of attorney over the entire Silver Creek estate. He demanded an immediate multi-million-dollar cash advance, offering the pristine, unencumbered ranch as a rock-solid guarantee. He thought he had just secured his salvation. He thought he had outsmarted the old fool in the barn and found the perfect way to pay off the dangerous men hunting him. I picked up my pitchfork and drove it into the hay once more. The trap had not just been set. My son had eagerly stepped inside and locked the heavy iron door behind himself. By using a document obtained through explicit fraud to secure a multi-million-dollar loan across state financial lines, he had just elevated his petty local greed into a massive, undeniable federal crime. The avalanche was already moving. He simply could not hear the roar yet. The ink on that fraudulent document was barely dry before Aaron brought the vultures to feed. The next morning, a fleet of white utility trucks rumbled down the gravel driveway, kicking up a storm of dust that coated the pine trees. I stood in the shadow of the barn doors, watching men in high-visibility vests and hard hats spill out onto the pasture. They carried tripods, laser levels, and topographical maps. They were not looking at the health of the soil or the structural integrity of the fences. They were surveyors brought in to carve up the estate into profitable, lifeless slices. Aaron marched at the front of the pack, gesturing wildly toward the southern ridge. He led them directly to the creeks, the very arteries of this ranch. In Montana, land is valuable, but water rights are gold. Vincent had fought brutal legal battles for a decade to secure those aquifers, ensuring the cattle and the local ecosystem survived the harsh, dry summers. Aaron was pricing them by the gallon, preparing to sell the lifeblood of Silver Creek to the highest corporate bidder. He flaunted his newly acquired power of attorney like a shield, waving it at the lead surveyor whenever a question of boundaries arose. He believed that single signature granted him dominion over the earth itself. I did not interrupt them. I watched the surveyors drive wooden stakes with neon pink ribbons deep into the pastures, marking the death of the ranch. The physical bleeding of the land had begun, but I knew the soil could wait. my immediate problem was unfolding closer to the main house. While Aaron measured the water, his wife focused on drowning the spirits of the men who worked it. Valerie stepped out onto the front porch, holding a leather-bound clipboard. She had spent the morning reviewing the payroll, not to understand the operation, but to find vulnerabilities. She walked down to the gravel courtyard, where the ranch hands gathered for their morning assignments. She did not summon them with respect. She clapped her hands together sharply, treating grown men who possessed more integrity in their calloused hands than she held in her entire soul, like disobedient stray dogs. Her eyes locked onto Wyatt. Wyatt was a mountain of a man, weathered by the sun and scarred by 50 years of hard labor. He had been Vincent's foreman for 2 decades. He was the man who had pulled calves from freezing mud, who had fought wildfires on the eastern ridge, who had stood by my brother when the winters threatened to break us all. He commanded absolute respect from every hand on this property. Valerie understood this immediately. Predators always target the alpha to break the pack. She called Wyatt out from the group, forcing him to stand isolated in the center of the courtyard. Her voice was intentionally loud, carrying across the crisp morning air, so every worker would hear the humiliation. She began reading from her clipboard, dissecting his salary, his housing allowance, and his medical benefits. She mocked the modest pension Vincent had arranged for him. She called his lifetime of loyalty an egregious drain on the estate's resources. She looked at this proud, silent man and told him that his archaic farming methods were no longer required. She told him he was officially terminated effective immediately and demanded he vacate the foreman's cabin by nightfall. The courtyard fell dead silent. The younger ranch hands shifted nervously, their hands balled into fists, looking to Wyatt for a signal. They were ready to walk off the job right then and there. Wyatt stood perfectly still. He removed his battered Stetson, revealing a head of thick, graying hair. He did not raise his voice. He did not give Valerie the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply nodded, turned on his heel, and walked toward his truck. Valerie smirked, writing a sharp checkmark on her clipboard. She turned to the remaining men and announced that their wages were being reduced by 20% to cover the cost of modernizing the operation. She warned them that anyone who objected could follow the old man out the gate. Her cruelty was absolute, driven by a desperate need to feel powerful. She thought she was cutting away the dead weight. She had no idea she was handing me the very weapon I needed to destroy her. I left the shadows of the barn and took a narrow dirt path that intercepted the main road leading out of the property. I waited behind a cluster of ancient oak trees. Moments later, Wyatt's heavy pickup truck rattled down the path. I stepped out into the middle of the road, raising my hand. Wyatt slammed on the brakes, the tires biting into the dirt. He rolled down the window. The engine idled, a low, steady rumble in the quiet morning. His face was a mask of restrained fury. He looked at me, waiting for an explanation, perhaps expecting me to offer a futile apology for the behavior of my so-called family. "Turn the engine off, Wyatt," I said, leaning against the doorframe. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned the key. The heavy silence of the Montana wilderness returned. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I gave this ranch 20 years of my life, John," he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "I watched your brother die. I put him in the ground. And now some city girl with a clipboard tells me I have until sunset to pack my life into boxes. I want to respect Vincent's memory, but if I stay here another hour, I cannot promise I will not take an axe handle to that leased car of theirs. I understand the anger," I replied, my voice steady and low. "But anger without strategy is just noise. Aaron and Valerie believe they hold all the cards because they hold a piece of paper with my signature on it. They think they fired you. They think they just established dominance over the crew." I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I pulled out a thick sealed envelope and dropped it onto the dashboard in front of him. Wyatt looked down at the envelope, then back up at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" I did not go completely blind when I lost my business. 12 years ago, I explained, looking straight through the windshield toward the main house. Vincent and I knew the vultures would circle the moment his heart stopped. We set up an independent hidden trust account years ago, completely disconnected from the primary estate ledger. Aaron and Valerie have no idea it exists. Inside that envelope is a cashier's check covering your full salary, your benefits, and a substantial bonus for the next 6 months. You are not fired, Wyatt. You are simply receiving new orders. Wyatt picked up the envelope. The weight of the paper seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the conversation. He ran his thumb over the seal, his eyes narrowing, as he processed the magnitude of what I was telling him. "What are the orders?" he asked, the fury in his voice instantly transforming into sharp, focused attention. "You are going to drive down to the county line and park your truck at the old diner I instructed. You are going to let them believe you packed up and fled like a beaten dog. Valerie needs to believe her cruelty was perfectly effective. Aaron needs to believe his authority is absolute. But tonight, when the sun goes down, you are going to slip back onto this property through the logging road. You are going to gather every single ranch hand who stood in that courtyard today. You are going to tell them that their wages are secured through my trust and that they no longer work for Silver Creek. They work for me." Wyatt's grip on the steering wheel relaxed. The ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked back toward the sprawling pastures, watching the surveyors in their bright vests driving stakes into the ground. He saw the violation of the land, but now he saw the trap being laid around it. They want to modernize the operation. I continued, letting the cold reality of the plan settle over us. We are going to let them. They are going to need the cooperation of the crew to maintain the illusion of a functioning ranch when they bring those corporate buyers to the table. I want the men to smile. I want them to follow Valerie's absurd orders to the letter. I want them to become ghosts in their own home. They will be the eyes and ears of this property. Every phone call Aaron makes, every document Valerie signs, every lock they try to change. I want to know about it before they even finish the thought. Wyatt nodded slowly, slipping the envelope into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. He understood the assignment perfectly. He was a tactician of the land, and he recognized a flanking maneuver when he saw one. "They think they just cleared the board," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "They think they just bought an empire," I corrected him. "But all they did was finance their own prison. Go to the diner, Wyatt. Have a coffee. Wait for the dark." He turned the key. The heavy engine roared back to life. He did not say goodbye. He put the truck in gear and drove toward the main gate, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. I stood in the road and watched him go. Valerie's arrogance had done the impossible. In her desperate attempt to assert dominance, she had bypassed the messy, complicated process of testing loyalty. By publicly humiliating the most respected man on the ranch, she had instantly radicalized the entire workforce. She had severed their emotional ties to the estate and bound their loyalty exclusively to the man who paid them in secret. She had not fired a crew. She had inadvertently forged a private, highly motivated army embedded deep within the walls of the fortress she was trying to steal. I turned my back to the gate and walked slowly toward the barn. The surveyors were still driving stakes into the earth. Aaron was still marching across the grass, pointing at the creeks, counting money that did not exist. I felt the cool wind rush down from the mountain peaks. The land was bleeding, but it was a calculated sacrifice. Every drop of blood drawn by their arrogance was simply bait, drawing the predators deeper into the jaws of the machine. I stepped back into the shadows of the barn, locked the heavy wooden doors, and turned my eyes to the security monitors. The game had shifted. I was no longer just watching. I was commanding the board. The heavy wooden doors of the barn shut with a resounding thud, cutting off the noise of the surveyors and the biting Montana wind. To the outside world, this structure was a relic, a dusty monument to agricultural decay, filled with rusted plows and dry rot. Aaron and Valerie had taken one look at the peeling red paint and dismissed it as a graveyard for broken things. They never bothered to walk past the wall of stacked hay bales. If they had, they would have found the reinforced steel door hidden entirely from view. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner, concealed beneath a loose piece of timber. The heavy deadbolts retracted with a mechanical hiss. I pulled the steel door open and stepped into the true nerve center of Silver Creek. The air inside was chilled and meticulously filtered, humming with the quiet, continuous power of a dozen high-capacity servers. Vincent had been a rancher, but he had also been a man who understood that modern empires are protected by data, not just barbed wire. This room was his fortress. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, surrounded by a curved bank of glowing monitors displaying every camera angle, every sensor, and every secure file related to the estate. I sat down in the leather chair, the screens bathing my face in cold blue light. My shoulder ached deeply from where Aaron had slammed me against the porch railing, but the physical pain only sharpened my absolute focus. I reached for the encrypted satellite phone resting on the desk and punched in a private sequence of numbers. It rang exactly twice before the secure video feed flickered to life on the center monitor. Michael Sullivan appeared on the screen. He was seated in his sleek, glass-walled office in Chicago, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit. Sullivan was the estate lawyer Vincent had retained a decade ago. He was a ruthless, brilliant legal shark who viewed sentimentality as a fatal weakness. He did not offer empty condolences regarding my brother. He simply looked through the camera, his piercing gray eyes locked onto mine, ready to work. Aaron just took the bait. I told him, my voice steady in the quiet room. He forced a forged power of attorney on me out by the stables. I signed it without hesitation. He already called a high-risk commercial lending firm in the city to secure a massive cash advance against the ranch. Sullivan did not blink. A predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Excellent," he replied, his voice a smooth, calculated drawl over the encrypted line. "By leveraging a forged document to cross state financial lines, your son has just upgraded his local tantrum into a federal felony. But we need to know exactly how deep his desperation runs." Aaron did not come to Montana to play rancher. A man does not risk federal wire fraud unless he has a gun pointed at his head. "Let us open him up." Sullivan's fingers danced across his keyboard. On my right monitor, a mirrored feed of his investigation software appeared. We began a deep, relentless financial autopsy of Aaron's life over the past 12 years. The results cascaded down the screen in damning waves. My son had spent the last decade projecting the image of a wealthy, sophisticated urban developer, laughing at the ruins of my own bankrupted construction firm. He had called me a dead weight. Yet staring at the raw financial data, the bitter irony of his hypocrisy tasted like ash in my mouth. Aaron was drowning. He was an illusion wrapped in designer suits and leased luxury vehicles. The data revealed a horrific trail of shell companies, defaulted commercial loans, and shattered partnerships. His credit was obliterated. Legitimate banks had blacklisted him years ago. But the real danger emerged when Sullivan bypassed the standard credit bureaus and tapped into the dark, unlisted ledgers of the shadow economy. "There it is," Sullivan murmured, his tone dropping an octave. A massive red flag illuminated the screen. $2 million. It was a staggering, toxic debt held by a front company known to be the financial arm of a violent underground syndicate. Aaron had borrowed money from predators who did not send collection letters. They sent men in dark vehicles to break bones and burn houses. The debt was severely past due. The men in the black SUVs I had seen idling at the property line earlier this week were not real estate scouts. They were the syndicate's enforcers tightening the noose around my son's neck. Aaron was a dead man walking. His urgency to seize the master suite, to fire the ranch handguns, to immediately liquidate the water rights had absolutely nothing to do with grief or inheritance. It was a frantic, terrified scramble to find $2 million in cash before the syndicate decided to collect his life instead. I stared at the staggering number on the screen. Any lingering shred of paternal mercy I might have harbored evaporated in the cold light of the monitors. He had brought violent criminals to the very edge of Vincent's sanctuary. "The predatory lender he called this morning will require a preliminary title search before they wire him a single dime," Sullivan stated, breaking the silence. "They operate in the gray market, but they are not stupid. They will check the county land registry to ensure Silver Creek is not burdened by liens or locked in a trust. If they see the irrevocable trust Vincent established, they will decline the loan. Aaron's entire scheme will hit a brick wall, and the syndicate will likely kill him before the police ever get a chance to arrest him. "We cannot let him fail yet," I said, leaning closer to the microphone. "The trap needs him to succeed in securing that fraudulent loan. The moment the wire transfer hits his account based on that forged power of attorney, the federal trap snaps shut. The crime becomes irreversible." "Exactly," Sullivan agreed. "We need to make the ranch look like a pristine, defenseless gold mine. We need to lower the drawbridge." I turned my attention to the secure terminal on my left. Vincent had maintained high-level administrative access to the county's digital land registry portal, a necessity for managing the complex, overlapping parcels of the massive estate. I logged into the system, navigating through the archaic municipal database until I reached the public-facing title records for Silver Creek. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I was about to alter the digital reality of the land. With a series of precise, calculated keystrokes, I initiated a temporary suppression protocol on the irrevocable trust flag. I buried the legal protections deep within the unindexed archives of the county server. To anyone conducting a standard front-end title search, all the armor Vincent had spent years forging simply vanished. The digital registry updated with a soft chime. Silver Creek now appeared as an entirely unencumbered asset. It looked like $50 million of pure, accessible equity registered solely under my name, free and clear of any trusts or legal guardianships. I sat back and stared at the clean digital deed. It was the perfect bait. It was a bleeding piece of meat suspended over a pool of starving sharks. When Aaron's predatory lenders checked the county records in the morning, their eyes would widen at the sheer unprotected value of the land. They would eagerly approve his multi-million-dollar cash advance, blinded by the prospect of foreclosing on an asset worth 10 times the loan amount. "The trap is set," I told Sullivan. "The property looks completely exposed. The lenders will greenlight the funds." Sullivan nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over his features. "Your son thinks he is the smartest man in the room. He thinks he just outmaneuvered a broken old man. Let him celebrate his victory. Let him sign the final loan documents and take the syndicate's money. I will begin drafting the federal fraud injunctions. When the ink dries on that wire transfer, we bring down the guillotine." The screen went black as Sullivan disconnected the feed. I sat alone in the quiet hum of the server room. Above me, I knew Aaron was probably walking through the main house, drinking stolen wine, feeling the heavy weight of his syndicate debt beginning to lift from his shoulders. He believed the forged power of attorney had granted him absolute control over the earth beneath his feet. He had no idea that I was controlling the very air he breathed. I had given him exactly what he wanted, ensuring that his own desperate, boundless greed would be the instrument of his total annihilation. The first sign of the impending storm did not come from the sky. It came in the form of 2 black, heavily tinted sport utility vehicles that rolled to a halt just beyond the main gates of Silver Creek. They did not honk. They did not use the intercom. They simply parked shoulder to shoulder, their heavy engines idling with a low, menacing rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very roots of the pine trees. From the safety of the reinforced barn, I watched them on the high-definition security monitors. The Montana sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley, but the vehicles remained completely stationary. They were a blatant, ugly anomaly against the pristine landscape. They were predators waiting at the edge of the watering hole. I zoomed in on the lead vehicle using the camera mounted on the stone pillar of the gate. I could not see the faces behind the dark glass, but I did not need to. Michael Sullivan had already painted a crystal-clear picture of the men who held my son's debt. They were the enforcement wing of a ruthless underground syndicate, men who did not negotiate, who did not care about the promises of future wealth, and who certainly did not respect the boundaries of private property. They had tracked Aaron from the city, drawn by the scent of his desperation and the rumors of his new inheritance. Their presence was a silent, suffocating ultimatum. I switched the feed to the main living room of the ranch house. The contrast between the silent menace outside and the absolute panic inside was jarring. Aaron was pacing the length of the hardwood floor like a trapped animal. The arrogant, untouchable businessman who had shoved me against the porch railing mere hours ago was completely gone. His crisp white shirt was unbuttoned and soaked with sweat. He dragged his hands through his hair, leaving it standing on end in wild, erratic tufts. His chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. He held his sleek smartphone pinned against his ear, screaming at Valerie. The advanced audio sensors Vincent had installed in the ceiling captured every pathetic, terrifying word. Aaron was losing his mind. He shouted that the syndicate had found them, that the deadline had expired 2 days ago, and that the grace period bought by his empty promises had officially run out. He cursed Valerie for spending money they did not have, for renting the luxury SUV parked in the driveway, for pretending they were royalty, while a $2 million anvil hung directly over their heads. Through the audio feed, I heard Valerie crying hysterically on the other end of the line, blaming him for the failure of his latest real estate venture, demanding he fix the problem before those men came inside and did something unspeakable. Aaron threw his empty glass across the room. It shattered violently against the stone fireplace. He screamed that he could not magically produce $2 million in cash, that the commercial loan from the predatory lenders was still processing, and that the men outside would not wait for a bank transfer. They wanted blood or collateral, and they wanted it before the sun went down. He hung up the phone and stood frozen in the middle of the room. His eyes darted wildly around the lavish space, landing on the expensive artwork, the antique furniture, the pure, unadulterated wealth of my brother's legacy. But none of that was liquid. None of that could stop a bullet. He needed something tangible, something of undeniable immediate value to hand to the wolves at the gate. I watched him sprint down the hallway toward Vincent's study. The door he had previously shattered with a fire axe hung loosely on its broken hinges. He pushed past it, ignoring the expensive wine collection he had plundered the night before. He headed straight for the large, heavy oak bookcase at the back of the room. He grabbed the edges of the central shelf and pulled. The hidden mechanism released, and the bookcase swung outward, revealing a solid steel wall safe bolted directly into the foundation of the house. Vincent had never kept his most vital documents in a bank vault. He trusted steel and concrete more than he trusted bankers. Aaron knew the safe existed. He had spent his teenage years trying to guess the combination. What Aaron did not know was that I had spent the last 2 hours meticulously curating the contents of that exact safe. He punched the numbers into the keypad with frantic, trembling fingers. He used Vincent's birth date, the most obvious combination for a man who rarely changed his routines. The heavy steel bolts clicked and the door swung open. Aaron dropped to his knees, plunging his hands into the dark compartment, pulling out stacks of old tax returns, maintenance logs, and veterinary records. He tossed them over his shoulder, his panic escalating with every useless piece of paper. Then his hands closed around the thick, heavy manila folder I had placed right at the bottom. He ripped the folder open. Inside was a stack of crisp, official-looking documents. They were physical copies of the property deeds to Silver Creek, perfectly mirroring the altered digital registry I had created earlier. But more importantly, attached to the very front of the deeds was a flawless copy of the sweeping power of attorney he had forced me to sign by the stables. The document bore his name, my forged submission, and the heavy brass stamp of his shady notary. Aaron stared at the papers. His breathing hitched. In his terrified, desperate mind, this was the ultimate golden ticket. He believed he was holding the legal keys to an unencumbered $50 million empire, proving he had the absolute authority to liquidate the estate. It was the perfect collateral. It was his only shield against the men idling at the gate. He clutched the folder to his chest, scrambled to his feet, and ran back down the hallway. I switched the camera feed back to the front gate. The sun had finally vanished, cloaking the valley in a deep, bruised twilight. Aaron burst out of the front door and sprinted down the long gravel driveway. He did not look like a master of the land. He looked like a beggar running for his life. He stopped 10 feet away from the lead SUV, holding the folder high above his head, like a white flag of surrender. The engine of the lead vehicle died. The heavy doors opened. 3 men stepped out into the crisp mountain air. They did not look like local thugs. They wore dark, tailored coats, their movements precise, silent, and overwhelmingly violent in their stillness. The leader, a tall man with a face carved from granite, walked slowly toward my son. Aaron was talking a mile a minute, the audio picking up his high, reedy voice carrying over the wind. He shoved the folder into the tall man's hands. He pointed frantically toward the sprawling pastures, toward the main house, toward the sheer, undeniable value of the ranch. He swore that the estate was entirely in his control, that the commercial loan was already in the final stages of underwriting, and that the syndicate would have their $2 million with a massive interest penalty in a matter of days. He offered the physical deeds and the power of attorney as a guarantee, begging them to verify the county registry, assuring them the land was completely free of any trusts or liens. The tall man opened the folder. He produced a small flashlight, illuminating the crisp legal text and the shiny notary seal. He studied the documents in absolute silence. For a long, agonizing minute, the fate of my son hung suspended in the freezing Montana air. The syndicate did not want a piece of paper. They wanted cash. But men who operate in the shadows also understand the value of $50 million in prime unregistered real estate. The tall man closed the folder. He looked at Aaron, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice that cut through the wind. He told my son that paper was fragile, that patience was entirely exhausted, and that collateral only mattered if it turned into liquid cash. He tapped the heavy manila folder against Aaron's chest, pushing him back a step. He gave Aaron exactly 48 hours, not a minute more. If the money was not wired into their accounts by the time the sun set on the second day, they would not come back to talk. They would come back to collect the flesh from his bones. The tall man turned his back, climbed into the SUV, and slammed the door. The engines roared to life, kicking up a storm of dust and gravel as the vehicles reversed and disappeared down the dark highway. Aaron collapsed onto his knees in the middle of the driveway. He dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. He had survived the night, but he was holding a ticking time bomb. I sat in the barn watching him weep in the dirt. He had bought himself 2 days of life, but the cost was an unbearable, crushing acceleration of his plans. The commercial loan he had applied for would take at least a week to process, time he absolutely did not have. The syndicate's ultimatum fundamentally altered the battlefield. He could no longer wait for banks. He could no longer rely on standard financial procedures. Aaron slowly picked himself up from the gravel, clutching the decoy folder like a lifeline. He stumbled back toward the main house, a man running entirely on the fumes of pure terror. He marched straight to the living room and grabbed his phone. I listened through the audio feed as he scrolled through his contacts and dialed a new number. He was calling the corrupt corporate developers he had boasted to earlier. His voice was no longer arrogant. It was sharp, frantic, and reckless. He told the lead developer to bring a team to Silver Creek immediately. He abandoned all pretense of a measured strategic negotiation. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it by tomorrow evening. He offered them the entire multi-million-dollar estate for a fraction of its true value, demanding a massive, immediate, non-refundable cash deposit to secure the deal. It was a fire sale fueled by the threat of murder. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the blue light of the monitors wash over me. The syndicate had played their part perfectly. The invisible pressure had cracked Aaron's composure, forcing him into a rushed, illegal, and utterly fatal transaction. He was preparing to sell a stolen empire to corrupt buyers, all based on a forged document and a manipulated registry. The noose was tied, measured, and placed perfectly around his neck. All I had to do now was wait for him to jump. The morning sun had barely breached the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains when the frantic rhythm of Aaron's desperation infected the main house. Through the narrow window of the barn, I watched him pace the gravel driveway. He was manic. He barked sharp, panicked orders at Valerie, who was frantically arranging catered platters of expensive food on the back patio. Today was the day. The corporate developers were arriving to inspect their stolen prize. Aaron needed everything to look like a perfectly functioning, highly profitable enterprise. He needed the illusion of absolute control to secure the immediate non-refundable cash deposit that would save his life from the syndicate. But there was one loose thread he could not easily tuck away. Me. I stepped out into the cool morning air, holding a worn leather bridle I had been repairing. Aaron spotted me immediately. He marched across the dirt, his face tight with panic and barely suppressed rage. He stopped 3 feet away, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at my faded canvas jacket and my grease-stained jeans with profound, unfiltered revulsion. "You are going to stay in that barn until I tell you otherwise," he commanded. His voice was a harsh, trembling hiss. "Do you understand me? There are men coming here today who deal in multi-million-dollar acquisitions. They expect to meet the owner of a pristine luxury estate. They do not want to see a dirty, bankrupt squatter lingering around the stables." His words were designed to cut, to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of his fabricated hierarchy. It triggered a vivid, bitter memory. Years ago, shortly after my construction firm collapsed, I had visited Aaron at his upscale apartment in the city to deliver a birthday gift. He had rushed me inside, terrified his wealthy neighbors might see the failed contractor standing in the hallway. He had always treated my existence as a stain on his perfectly curated image. Now facing the men who would buy his survival, my presence was an unacceptable liability. "I want the barn doors locked from the inside." He continued, his tone escalating when I did not immediately answer. "I do not want you looking out the windows. I do not want you making a sound. If these investors catch even a glimpse of you, they will ask questions I do not have the time to answer. You will stay hidden like the ghost you are." He waited for the argument. He craved a fight to release the agonizing pressure building inside his chest. He wanted me to yell to assert my wounded pride so he could crush it and feel powerful. I gave him the exact opposite. I lowered my head. I let my shoulders slump, mimicking the posture of a defeated, broken old man who had finally accepted his miserable fate. I did not meet his eyes. I turned around without speaking a single word and walked slowly back into the dark interior of the barn. I pulled the heavy wooden doors shut. The heavy iron latch fell into place with a definitive echoing clack. Outside, I heard Aaron let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. He thought he had conquered his final obstacle. He believed he had successfully swept his embarrassing father under the rug. He walked away to prepare for his guests, entirely oblivious to the reality that he had just handed me the perfect, unquestionable alibi. I did not stay near the doors. I moved swiftly to the back of the barn, passing the stacks of hay and rusted tools until I reached the concealed steel entrance of Vincent's security hub. I pressed my thumb to the scanner, stepped inside, and engaged the heavy deadbolts. The room was cold, humming with the quiet power of the servers. I sank into the leather chair and brought the wall of high-definition monitors to life. 30 minutes later, the buyers arrived. 3 sleek black town cars glided through the main gates of Silver Creek. They parked in a synchronized line in front of the main house. 5 men and 1 woman stepped out onto the gravel. They were sharks in bespoke suits. They possessed the hungry, assessing eyes of predators who made their fortunes by carving up the desperate legacies of others. They did not look at the majestic pine trees or the sweeping pastures with appreciation. They looked at them with calculators behind their eyes. Aaron practically tripped over his own feet, rushing out to greet them. His smile was wide, desperate, and entirely fake. He shook their hands with exaggerated enthusiasm. Valerie stood on the porch playing the role of the wealthy, sophisticated heiress, holding a tray of crystal glasses filled with sparkling water. They projected the perfect image of a successful young couple eager to liquidate a massive asset for their next big venture. I watched the lead developer, an older man with silver hair and a sharp, predatory gaze, ask a question. The hidden audio microphones picked up his voice perfectly. He wanted to see the water sources. He wanted to walk the property line. He wanted to ensure the $50 million valuation was grounded in physical reality. Aaron eagerly agreed. He led the pack of corporate vultures away from the main house, gesturing grandly toward the rolling hills. He was leading them on a tour of a kingdom he had already lost. The moment they crested the first hill, disappearing from the immediate view of the driveway, I picked up my secure radio transmitter. Now, I said softly into the microphone. Deep in the timberline, miles away from the main house, the radio crackled to life. Wyatt's voice came through gravelly and focused. "Copy that. Initiating lockdown." The symphony of silence began. I switched my primary monitors to the perimeter cameras. For the past 24 hours, Wyatt and the ranch hands had been ghosts hiding in the dense forests that bordered the property. They had not gone to the diner to drown their sorrows over being fired. They had gone to the hardware store. They had purchased heavy steel chains, industrial padlocks, and bolt cutters using the funds from the trust account I controlled. On screen 4, I watched Wyatt and 3 men approach the main front gate. This was the expensive wrought iron entrance Aaron had proudly left open to welcome his buyers. Wyatt did not use a key. He knelt by the electronic control box hidden in the stone pillar. With a pair of heavy wire cutters, he severed the primary power lines. The security light on the keypad died instantly. The men pulled the massive iron gates shut. They wrapped a thick logging-grade steel chain around the center bars, securing it with an unpickable hardened padlock. The main exit was permanently sealed. On screen 7, I monitored the secondary access points. Silver Creek possessed 3 dirt logging roads used to transport heavy equipment into the high country. I watched as 2 large diesel-powered tractors roared out of the tree line. The loyal ranch hands drove them directly across the narrow dirt paths, parking them sideways to completely block the route. They killed the engines, removed the distributor caps, and took the ignition keys. The heavy machinery formed an impenetrable steel barricade against the dense forest walls. No vehicle could possibly get through. On screen 9, the final phase of the siege unfolded. Men moved along the northern fence line, deliberately cutting the communication wires that linked the main house to the local municipal grid. They disabled the backup cellular repeaters Vincent had installed on the water tower. They systematically severed Silver Creek from the outside world. It was a flawless military-style execution. The ranch hands moved with the quiet, furious precision of men defending their home from invaders. They were not just following my orders. They were exacting their own justice against the woman who had humiliated them and the man who was trying to sell their livelihoods to the highest bidder. Within 15 minutes, the entire perimeter was entirely compromised and completely secure. Silver Creek was cut off. It was no longer a sprawling open ranch. It was an inescapable fortress. I leaned back in my chair watching the center monitor. Aaron was standing near the edge of the creek, laughing loudly at a joke made by the silver-haired developer. He was pointing at the water, sketching castles in the air, imagining the massive, non-refundable cash deposit that would soon hit his fraudulent bank account. He believed he was cementing the deal of a lifetime. He believed he was outsmarting the underground syndicate and walking away a very rich man. He had no idea that the gates were chained shut. He had no idea that the roads were blocked by dead tractors. He did not realize that the moment those corporate developers attempted to leave the property to process the paperwork, they would find themselves trapped inside a sealed compound. Aaron thought he was the king of the mountain. He did not know he was merely the warden of his own cage. He had locked himself inside with men who would sue him into oblivion, while a violent syndicate waited just beyond the tree line for a payment that would never arrive. The jaws of the trap were completely closed. Now it was time to turn on the lights and let them see the teeth. The grand living room of the main house at Silver Creek was a cathedral of timber and river stone. My brother Vincent had designed it to reflect the permanence of the mountains surrounding us. He used to sit by the massive hearth negotiating cattle contracts on nothing more than a firm handshake and a shared cup of black coffee. Men trusted Vincent because his word was as solid as the oak beams overhead. Now the room had been hijacked by a desperate coward trying to auction off a stolen legacy. Through the heavy glass windows of the front doors, I could see the grotesque pantomime unfolding inside. Aaron sat at the head of Vincent's custom dining table, leaning over a thick stack of preliminary transfer documents. His hand moved frantically across the pages. He was signing away water rights, timber access, and centuries of fertile topsoil. Across from him sat the silver-haired lead developer from the city, flanked by two junior partners in sharp, tailored suits. They watched Aaron with the detached amusement of predators who knew they were getting an absolute bargain. They did not care why the estate was being sold at such a reckless discount. They only cared about the profit margins. Valerie hovered near the fireplace, playing the gracious hostess to perfection. She held a crystal bottle of vintage champagne, pouring generous measures into tall flutes. Her laughter drifted through the thick glass light and artificial. She believed the nightmare was over. She believed the syndicate would be paid, the debts would be erased, and she would walk away with millions in surplus cash. She handed a glass to the lead developer, offering a dazzling smile. Aaron flipped to the final page of the contract. I could see the tension radiating from his rigid shoulders. He was sweating despite the cool air conditioning. The invisible clock of the underground syndicate was ticking loudly in his ears. He needed the developer to initiate the wire transfer immediately. Once that massive cash deposit hit his account, he could pay off the men in the dark vehicles and breathe again. He capped his pen and pushed the signed contract across the polished wood. The developer picked it up, reviewing the signatures with a satisfied nod. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his phone, preparing to authorize the multi-million-dollar wire transfer. The trap was fully primed. It was time to pull the trigger. I turned away from the window and looked at the two men standing beside me on the front porch. Michael Sullivan adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate charcoal suit. He held a slim leather briefcase containing the true digital registry logs, the original trust documents, and the federal fraud injunctions we had drafted just hours ago. He looked as calm as a surgeon preparing to make an incision. On my right stood Wyatt. The foreman had shed his heavy work jacket, standing tall in a faded denim shirt. His jaw was set like granite. He had spent the last 2 hours coordinating the lockdown of the perimeter, ensuring that the corporate buyers currently sitting in the living room had absolutely no way to leave the property. "Are we ready?" John Sullivan asked, his voice a smooth, even baritone. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pushed it open. The heavy wooden door swung inward with a low groan that echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous living room. The cheerful clinking of crystal glasses stopped instantly. The artificial laughter died in Valerie's throat. The corporate developers turned their heads in unison, annoyed by the sudden interruption. I stepped over the threshold. Sullivan and Wyatt flanked me, moving with deliberate, synchronized precision. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I did not look at the developers. I locked my eyes entirely on my son. Aaron was halfway out of his chair, his hand reaching for the champagne flute Valerie had just poured for him. When he saw me standing in the foyer, the color drained completely from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the floorboards. For a fraction of a second, the sheer terror of his syndicate debt flashed across his eyes. He thought I was going to ruin the illusion. He thought the developers would see a filthy, bankrupt squatter and start asking questions that would delay the wire transfer. The absolute panic in his chest quickly mutated into explosive, aggressive rage. He slammed his hands flat against the oak table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle. "What are you doing in here?" Aaron demanded, his voice cracking as he tried to project an authority he did not possess. "I told you to stay out by the stables. We are conducting official private business." He turned quickly to the lead developer, offering a frantic, sweating smile. "I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen. This is just a confused former caretaker. He is elderly, and he sometimes wanders away from his designated quarters. My wife and I are currently arranging for his transfer to a state facility. Please excuse the disturbance." The developer lowered his phone, raising a skeptical eyebrow. He looked at my steady gaze. He looked at Sullivan's expensive suit. He looked at the imposing mountain of a man standing to my right. This did not look like a confused caretaker wandering into a meeting. This looked like a coordinated tactical strike. Aaron realized his lie was failing. The desperation clawed at his throat. He needed the wire transfer authorized immediately, or the syndicate would murder him by nightfall. He turned his furious gaze toward Wyatt. "Wyatt, what the hell are you doing standing there?" Aaron screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the front door. "I fired you this morning. I ordered you off this property. Grab that old man right now and drag him back to the barn before I call the county sheriff and have you both arrested for criminal trespassing. Do it right now or I swear to God I will personally ensure you lose every dime of your severance." The living room fell into a suffocating silence. Valerie stepped back nervously, clutching the champagne bottle against her chest. The junior partners shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Aaron stood at the head of the table, breathing heavily, waiting for his command to be executed. He fully expected Wyatt to step forward and lay hands on me. He relied on the illusion of his power derived from that single forged piece of paper. He believed fear would force the working-class man into total compliance. Wyatt did not flinch. He did not look at Aaron. He slowly took off his battered Stetson, holding it loosely in his left hand. He looked around the grand living room, taking in the lavish architecture that his own sweat had helped maintain for 2 decades. Then he took one deliberate heavy step forward and crossed his arms over his chest. He stood shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a solid, impenetrable wall of defiance. "I do not work for you, son," Wyatt said, his gravelly voice echoing off the high timber ceilings. "I never have. And I sure as hell am not laying a hand on the rightful owner of Silver Creek." The words struck Aaron like a physical blow. His jaw slackened. The arrogant sneer melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked at Wyatt, then he looked at me. His brain scrambled to process the impossibility of the situation. He had publicly humiliated Wyatt in the courtyard. He had terminated his employment. He had demanded his eviction. Yet here, the foreman stood directly defying a direct order and aligning himself completely with the man Aaron believed he had legally erased. The power dynamic in the room shattered and realigned in a matter of seconds. The illusion of Aaron's absolute dominion over the ranch dissolved into dust. The lead developer slowly placed his phone face down on the polished oak table. He did not press the button to authorize the wire transfer. He steepled his fingers, leaning back in his chair. He was a man who smelled blood in the water. Aaron stared at the phone on the table. He saw his only lifeline to survival slipping away. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, to issue another desperate command, but his vocal cords seized. He was paralyzed by the sudden crushing realization that he had walked blindly into a trap. Michael Sullivan stepped forward, breaking the frozen tableau. He walked smoothly past the dining table, ignoring Valerie's terrified gasp. He stopped directly in front of the lead developer, placing his slim leather briefcase on the wood. He snapped the brass latches open with 2 sharp clicks. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Sullivan said, his voice radiating absolute legal authority. "My name is Michael Sullivan. I represent the primary irrevocable trust of the Silver Creek estate. I strongly advise you to put your checkbooks away. The man sitting across from you has no legal standing to sell this land. You are currently negotiating the purchase of stolen property based on a spectacularly clumsy case of federal wire fraud." Aaron let out a strangled, hollow sound. He backed away from the table, hitting the stone fireplace. He looked wildly toward the front door, toward the windows, toward any possible avenue of escape. But there was nowhere to run. The main gates were chained shut. The logging roads were barricaded, and the syndicate was waiting just beyond the tree line. He had built his own cage, and I had just locked the door. Michael Sullivan stepped up to the polished oak table and let the heavy leather binder slip from his fingers. It hit the thick glass surface with a resounding heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. The sound broke the paralyzing spell that had gripped the corporate developers. Aaron flinched, as if he had been struck physically. He stared at the worn leather cover with eyes wide and entirely uncomprehending. The frantic energy that had propelled him through the morning completely evaporated. It left behind a hollow, terrified shell. He opened his mouth to speak and perhaps offer some desperate lie, but no words came out. Valerie retreated further into the shadows near the fireplace. She clutched her crystal champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The illusion of their wealth and power was fracturing right in front of her eyes. The lead developer with the silver hair slowly pulled his hands away from the signed contracts. The predatory gleam in his eye was instantly replaced by a sharp, calculating caution. He was a man who survived in the cutthroat world of corporate acquisitions by knowing exactly when to step away from a toxic deal. He looked at Sullivan and recognized the unmistakable posture of a high-tier litigator who held all the winning cards. The two junior partners sitting beside him also stiffened. They realized the man they were about to give millions of dollars to was suddenly looking very much like a cornered animal. Sullivan did not rush. He unclasped the brass buckles of the binder with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Every click echoed loudly in the silent room. He opened the cover and smoothed his hand over the top document. It was printed on thick archival paper bearing the unmistakable watermarks of the federal courts. Sullivan cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was a cold, surgical instrument dissecting the fabricated empire Aaron had tried to build. He announced that he was the executor of the final legally binding will and testament of Vincent. He read the clauses clearly, ensuring every single person in the room understood the absolute unyielding nature of the law. Silver Creek was not an asset that could be bought or sold or leveraged. 10 years ago, Vincent had placed every acre of the land, every drop of the water rights, and every timber stand into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I stood quietly beside Wyatt and watched my son face contort with a mixture of disbelief and mounting horror. Aaron had spent weeks treating this ranch like his personal bank account. He believed his status as a nephew granted him a blank check. He had entirely underestimated his uncle. Vincent knew exactly what Aaron was. He knew the boy possessed no moral compass and a dangerous appetite for unearned luxury. Vincent had built an impenetrable fortress around his legacy long before the sickness took him. Sullivan continued reading while his voice sliced through the heavy air. The trust dictated that the estate could never be liquidated to cover personal debts. And most importantly, it established a single absolute trustee with total operational and financial control over Silver Creek. Sullivan looked up from the documents and fixed his cold gray eyes directly on Aaron. He announced that I was the sole uncontested trustee. Aaron began to shake uncontrollably. He pointed a trembling finger at the leather binder on the table. He stammered that he held a legally binding power of attorney. He claimed that I had signed away my rights out by the stables and that his documents superseded any old trust. He sounded exactly like a drowning man demanding the ocean give him back his air. He looked desperately at the developers, begging them to believe his narrative. Sullivan offered a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. He reached into the binder and pulled out a certified copy of the very document Aaron had forced upon me. Sullivan held it up for the room to see. He explained to the developers that a power of attorney is only valid if it is executed in good faith and if it pertains to assets the signatory actually owns outright. Because the estate was locked securely within an irrevocable trust, I did not personally own the land. Therefore, I possessed absolutely no legal capacity to assign those assets to anyone else. The power of attorney Aaron had so desperately relied upon was legally null and void from the exact moment the shady notary stamped it. It was a completely worthless piece of paper. Furthermore, Sullivan added, letting his voice drop to a lethal whisper. He explained that using a fraudulent document to secure commercial loans across state lines and attempting to sell assets held in a federal trust constituted a massive, undeniable case of wire fraud and grand larceny. Aaron had not secured a fortune today. He had simply meticulously documented his own federal crimes for the authorities. The atmosphere in the living room turned instantly toxic. The lead developer realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. He had almost wired millions of dollars to a blatant criminal. He had almost entangled his prestigious firm in a highly publicized federal fraud investigation. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson. He stood up from the oak table, causing his chair to scrape violently against the hardwood floor. He did not say a single word to Aaron. He simply reached out and grabbed the preliminary transfer contracts Aaron had just eagerly signed. With a sudden explosive burst of fury, the developer ripped the thick stack of papers in half. He tore them again and again and let the shredded pieces flutter down to the polished floor like dead leaves. His junior partners scrambled to their feet and hastily packed their briefcases. Their eyes were wide with sheer legal panic. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with this poisoned estate or the man who had tried to sell it to them. The lead developer pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my son's chest. He did not yell, but his voice was heavy with venom. He promised Aaron that his corporate legal team would scorch the earth. He promised that for wasting his time and for attempting to defraud a major corporation and for nearly dragging his firm into a federal indictment, he would unleash a tidal wave of lawsuits. He vowed to bury Aaron under litigation for the rest of his natural life. The developer turned on his heel and marched toward the front door. He grabbed the brass handle and pulled hard, eager to escape the suffocating walls of Silver Creek and return to the safety of the city. The heavy door opened, but Wyatt stepped smoothly into the frame and blocked the exit with his massive body. The developer looked up at the foreman, demanding to be let out of the house immediately. Wyatt simply shook his head and calmly informed the suited men that the main gates were currently chained shut and the perimeter roads were completely barricaded with heavy machinery. He told them they would have to wait patiently until the county sheriff arrived to process the active crime scene. The developers slowly realized they were entirely trapped inside a locked compound, alongside a man who had just tried to rob them blind. Valerie finally dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the stone hearth, creating a sharp ringing sound that perfectly underscored their total destruction. Aaron sank slowly onto the floor as his knees gave out completely beneath him. He was surrounded by the shredded remains of his fraudulent contracts. His guaranteed lifeline had evaporated in a matter of seconds. He had brought these corporate sharks here to save him from the underground syndicate waiting outside. Instead, he had just multiplied his enemies exponentially. The syndicate was still waiting beyond the tree line, hungry for their $2 million. And now a ruthless corporate legal team was trapped inside with him, preparing to dismantle whatever miserable fragments of his life remained. He sat in the dust of his own making, clutching his head as a prisoner in the very house he had tried to steal. The heavy silence that followed Michael Sullivan's declaration was broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing of my son. Aaron sat on the floor among the shredded remains of his preliminary contracts, staring at the polished oak legs of the dining table. The corporate developers had retreated to the far corner of the living room, keeping a safe distance from a man they now viewed as a toxic and highly volatile liability. They muttered furiously among themselves, already dialing their respective legal teams on their cell phones, preparing the avalanche of lawsuits that would bury Aaron by morning. Valerie had backed away completely. She was pressing her spine against the stone fireplace, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with the realization that the luxurious life she had envisioned was evaporating into thin air. She looked at her husband, not with concern or loyalty, but with the cold, calculating assessment of a parasite realizing its host was dead. I watched Aaron as the gears of his fractured mind ground against each other. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life dancing on the edge of legality, using charm and intimidation to cover his tracks. But there was no charm left. There was no intimidation that could work against the ironclad reality of Vincent's trust. Aaron slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dilated with a primal, unadulterated terror. He looked at the leather binder resting on the table. He looked at the decoy folder he had pulled from the safe earlier that afternoon. The forged power of attorney, the document bearing his signature, and the fraudulent notary seal was still sitting right there in plain sight. It was a physical anchor tying him directly to the crime. But his panic went deeper than a single piece of paper. He had manipulated the county land registry portal. He had authorized a predatory commercial loan using those fraudulent credentials. He suddenly realized that the digital footprint of his entire scheme was not floating anonymously in the cloud. The access logs, the network routing, the very keystrokes he had used to try and steal Silver Creek were all meticulously recorded and stored on the high-capacity servers humming quietly out in the barn. The barn he had ordered me to stay hidden inside. The barn he had dismissed as a graveyard for old farming equipment. He knew that as long as those servers existed, and as long as those forged physical documents remained intact, Michael Sullivan had the absolute power to send him to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The transition from a white-collar fraudster to a cornered, violent animal happened in the span of a single heartbeat. Aaron let out a guttural sound that barely resembled a human voice. It was a raw, animalistic roar of pure desperation. He scrambled up from the floor, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished wood. He did not look at Valerie. He did not look at the corporate buyers. He lunged toward the heavy wooden side door that led out to the wraparound porch. He threw his shoulder against the wood, bursting out into the cool evening air. Sullivan shifted his weight, pulling his suit jacket tight. He looked at me, his gray eyes narrowing. He asked if we should pursue him. Wyatt immediately took a heavy step toward the door, his hands balling into massive, calloused fists, ready to run my son down into the dirt. I raised my hand, signaling for both of them to stop. I told them to let him go. I explained that when an enemy is drowning in his own mistakes, the worst thing you can do is throw him a lifeline of physical confrontation. Aaron needed a way out, and his panicked mind had only found one catastrophic solution. I walked slowly toward the open side door, stepping out onto the porch. Wyatt and Sullivan followed closely behind me. We stood in the gathering twilight, looking out across the gravel courtyard. Aaron was sprinting across the driveway. The sun had completely disappeared behind the western ridge, leaving the ranch bathed in a deep purple gloom. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Aaron reached the side of the equipment shed, where the ranch hands stored the fuel for the heavy diesel generators and the riding mowers. He grabbed a massive red industrial gasoline canister. It was full and heavy, but Aaron hoisted it effortlessly, driven by the sheer adrenaline of a man fighting for his life. He turned and began to sprint directly toward the barn. His white dress shirt was glowing faintly in the dim light, his tie whipping wildly over his shoulder. He looked completely unhinged. He was no longer trying to save a business deal. He was trying to erase history. He believed that if he could just reduce the servers and the physical documents to ash, he could claim ignorance. He could blame the syndicate. He could weave a new web of lies to escape the federal prosecutors. He wanted to burn Silver Creek to the ground to save his own skin. Wyatt moved to step off the porch, his voice thick with anger, as he warned me that Aaron was going to ignite the entire structure. I did not move a single muscle. I stood with my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my canvas jacket. I told Wyatt to simply watch. Aaron reached the heavy wooden doors of the barn. He dropped the heavy gasoline canister onto the dirt with a loud, hollow thud. He grabbed the iron handles and pulled, but the doors were securely locked from the inside, exactly as he had commanded me to do earlier that morning. His frustration boiled over into violent rage. He took a step back, raised his leg, and kicked the center of the wooden doors with all his might. The ancient timber groaned but held. He kicked them again and again, screaming obscenities into the quiet mountain air. The sound of his heavy shoes slamming against the wood echoed across the courtyard, a pathetic rhythm of total defeat. With a final desperate strike, the weathered wood splintered and gave way. The doors cracked open just enough for him to force his body through the gap. He grabbed the red canister and dragged it into the dark interior of the barn. I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. I walked across the courtyard with a slow, measured pace. Sullivan and Wyatt matched my stride. We did not run. We moved like executioners approaching the gallows. We stopped 30 feet away from the barn doors. Through the splintered opening, I could hear the heavy splashing of liquid. Aaron was frantically unscrewing the cap of the canister, and hurling gallons of highly flammable gasoline across the stacked hay bales, over the wooden support beams, and directly toward the concealed steel door of the server room. The sharp, toxic stench of raw fuel spilled out into the courtyard, overpowering the crisp scent of the pine trees. I heard the canister drop to the dirt floor. I heard the frantic rustling of fabric as Aaron dug into his pockets. He was searching for the expensive silver lighter he always carried to impress his clients. He found it. I heard the metallic clink as he flipped the lid open. He was standing in a pool of volatile fumes, surrounded by dry hay and century-old timber. He held the spark of his own destruction in the palm of his trembling hand. He believed he was taking back control. He believed he was erasing the evidence of his fraud and buying his freedom with fire. I reached deep into the right pocket of my jacket. My fingers wrapped around the small, textured plastic of a remote control device. Vincent had installed it years ago when he upgraded the security perimeter. It was designed to illuminate the loading zones during the dark winter months. Aaron raised his hand. His thumb hovered over the flint of the silver lighter. He took a deep, jagged breath, preparing to ignite the inferno that would consume the legacy of Silver Creek. I pressed the button. A dozen stadium-grade security floodlights mounted along the high eaves of the barn ignited simultaneously. The sheer brilliance of the LED panels shattered the purple twilight with the intensity of a dying sun. The blinding, searing white light flooded the entire courtyard and punched directly through the splintered gaps of the barn doors. Inside the barn, Aaron screamed. The sudden, overwhelming explosion of light hit his dilated pupils like a physical strike. He dropped the lighter. It hit the dirt floor entirely unlit. He threw his hands up over his face, stumbling backward against a stack of gasoline-soaked hay bales. He was completely blinded, disoriented, and entirely illuminated. He was caught red-handed in the exact center of his own crime. He had walked into the barn as a desperate white-collar fraudster. By splashing that fuel and raising that lighter, he had just escalated his legal jeopardy into undeniable attempted arson. There was no shadow left for him to hide within. The corporate developers watching from the windows of the main house, the loyal ranch hands guarding the perimeter, and the high-definition cameras recording his every move had just witnessed the absolute total destruction of Aaron. The trap had not just closed, it had locked him inside a prison of blinding, undeniable light. I stood in the glaring white silence and watched my son fall to his knees in the dirt. The syndicate was waiting for their money. The lawyers were drafting their lawsuits, and Aaron had nothing left but the sharp, toxic smell of gasoline and the terrifying realization that he had engineered his own to perfect ruin. The blinding white light of the security panels held Aaron frozen in time. He knelt in the dirt floor of the barn, surrounded by the heavy toxic fumes of the gasoline he had just blindly thrown. His hands covered his eyes as he let out a low, agonizing moan of pure defeat. The silver lighter slipped from his trembling fingers and landed softly in the dry dust. It did not spark. The immediate danger of the fire was extinguished by the sheer, overwhelming shock of the illumination, but the trap was only just beginning to close around him. Then the sound arrived. It started as a distant wail echoing down the canyon, bouncing off the granite faces of the mountains. It was a sharp, piercing sound that shattered the quiet sanctuary of the Montana night. The wail grew louder and more frantic, multiplying into a chorus of high-pitched shrieks. The dark silhouette of the pine trees lining the main access road suddenly erupted in alternating flashes of crimson and sapphire. The police were coming. Wyatt stood beside me on the gravel, his posture relaxed and his breathing steady. He did not look surprised by the approaching sirens. He turned his head slightly and spoke in a low, calm voice. He told me that he had made the call the exact moment Aaron had pulled the forged deeds out of the decoy safe and presented them to the corporate developers. Wyatt had recognized the definitive proof of the crime, and he had immediately contacted the county sheriff detailing the fraudulent sale and the potential for a violent escalation. The trap had been perfectly synchronized. Every piece of the machine worked exactly as we had designed it. 4 heavy police cruisers tore down the dirt road leading to the main gates. They did not stop to ask for permission. The heavy tires chewed through the gravel as they bypassed the chained main entrance using the secondary service lane that Wyatt had specifically left open for them. They swarmed the front courtyard, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their sirens dying with a final fading growl. Doors flew open and heavy boots hit the ground. The officers moved with aggressive, practiced efficiency. They immediately smelled the overwhelming odor of the spilled gasoline pouring out of the splintered barn doors. They saw the blinding floodlights and the figure of a man kneeling in the center of the volatile puddle. Commands were shouted into the night air, crisp and authoritative. They ordered Aaron to keep his hands visible, to lower himself entirely to the ground, to not make a single sudden movement. Aaron was entirely disoriented. The sudden shift from his frantic arson attempt to the glaring lights and the shouting officers completely broke whatever remained of his cognitive function. He tried to stand up, his expensive shoes slipping on the fuel-soaked dirt. He mumbled something incoherent, raising one hand to shield his eyes from the glare. The officers did not hesitate. The combination of an uncooperative suspect and a massive quantity of highly flammable liquid demanded immediate physical control. 3 officers surged through the broken wooden doors. They descended on Aaron, tackling him hard to the earth. The impact drove the breath from his lungs with a sharp grunt. His pristine white dress shirt absorbed the filthy gasoline-soaked dirt. An officer swiftly kicked the silver lighter far away into a safe corner of the barn, eliminating the immediate threat of ignition. Heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Aaron's wrists, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. They hauled him up to his feet. His face was smeared with mud and oil, his eyes darting frantically around the courtyard. He looked at the police cruisers, he looked at the stoic faces of the ranch hands who had gathered near the fence line, and finally he looked at me. There was no arrogance left in him. There was only the raw, pathetic terror of a man who realized his entire existence had just been legally and physically dismantled. While the officers secured Aaron and began securing the hazardous scene inside the barn, another drama was rapidly unfolding on the manicured lawn of the main house. Valerie had been watching the entire spectacle from the safety of the stone porch. She had seen the arrival of the police, she had seen her husband dragged through the dirt, and she understood with terrifying clarity that the syndicate, the lawyers, and the authorities were all about to converge on them. Her dream of endless wealth had turned into a nightmare of federal prison sentences. Valerie possessed a profound instinct for self-preservation. She had always attached herself to power, and when power failed, she knew exactly how to detach herself. She did not hesitate for a single second. She did not run to her husband's side to offer comfort or solidarity. Instead, she initiated a masterful, instantaneous transformation. She let out a piercing, hysterical sob. She stumbled down the wooden steps of the porch, her designer heels sinking into the soft grass. She threw her hands over her face, weeping with a desperate, theatrical intensity. She ran directly toward the lead investigator, who was standing near the foremost police cruiser. She practically collapsed against the hood of the vehicle, gasping for air, painting herself as the ultimate victim of a horrific, controlling monster. The officer tried to calm her, asking her to step back and take a breath. Valerie refused to be calmed. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers flew across the screen, opening a hidden folder of messages and audio files. She shoved the glowing screen directly into the face of the investigator. She began to speak rapidly, her voice trembling with fabricated terror. She told the officer that she had nothing to do with the forged documents or the commercial loans. She claimed that Aaron had forced her to play along under the threat of severe physical violence. She wept as she explained that Aaron was deeply indebted to dangerous criminals in the city, and that his desperation had made him completely unhinged. She pointed a manicured finger at her husband, who was currently being pushed against the side of a police car. She called him a monster, a manipulator, and a dangerous fraud. To prove her point, she played an audio message from her phone. It was a voicemail Aaron had left her 2 days ago, screaming about the syndicate deadlines and threatening to ruin her life if she did not help him secure the estate. She scrolled through text messages where Aaron detailed his plan to force my signature and sell the water rights to the developers. Valerie had systematically documented his descent into madness, not out of moral objection, but as a calculated insurance policy. She had kept the receipts of his guilt ready to trade his freedom for her own the moment the ship began to sink. Aaron heard her voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. He twisted his neck, fighting against the grip of the officers holding him. He stared at his wife as she eagerly surrendered every detail of his criminal conspiracy to the authorities. The betrayal hit him harder than the physical tackle in the barn. The facade of their perfect, sophisticated marriage completely disintegrated right there on the front lawn of Silver Creek. They were not partners. They were two parasites who had finally turned on each other when the host proved too strong to consume. Aaron began to scream. He thrashed against the police officers, screaming that Valerie was the one who found the shady notary, that she was the one who encouraged him to take the syndicate money, that she had spent the stolen funds on luxury cars and expensive clothes. He cursed her name, begging the officers to arrest her as well. His voice was raw, tearing his throat, as he traded vicious, backstabbing insults with the woman he had promised to love. It was a pathetic, miserable display. The corporate developers stood silently on the porch, watching the couple destroy each other with absolute disgust. The ranch hands watched with quiet satisfaction, seeing the people who had treated them like dirt reduced to screaming criminals in the back of a police car. I stood motionless near the barn doors, the cool night air washing over my face. I did not feel joy. I did not feel the triumphant thrill of revenge. I simply felt the profound, heavy peace of a man who had successfully restored order to his home. Vincent had built this ranch on a foundation of integrity and hard work. Aaron and Valerie had tried to infect it with greed and deceit. I had merely provided the pressure necessary to expose the rot, and now the system was cleansing itself. The police officer holding Valerie's phone nodded gravely. He signaled to another deputy to come over and take her official statement. He informed her that while her cooperation was noted, she would still need to accompany them to the station for a full interrogation regarding her complicity in the federal wire fraud. Valerie's face fell as she realized her victim routine would not grant her immediate immunity, but she continued to sob, playing the role until the bitter end. The officers finished searching Aaron, finding the decoy keys and the fraudulent papers crumpled in his pockets. They pushed his head down and shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, trapping him inside a dark cage of his own making. The blue and red lights continued to wash over the pine trees, a stark reminder that the sanctuary of Silver Creek had been violated and defended in the same night. The land was safe, the water would continue to flow, and the ghosts of my brother's legacy could finally rest. The blinding white light of the security panels dissolved into a chaotic swirl of crimson and sapphire as a fleet of county police cruisers tore into the main courtyard of Silver Creek. The heavy tires chewed violently through the gravel, sending sprays of dirt and loose stones into the cold mountain air. The sirens wailed with a deafening, piercing intensity that bounced off the granite cliffs and shattered the quiet sanctuary of the ranch. Wyatt had not waited for permission. The moment Aaron had confidently presented the forged deeds and the fraudulent power of attorney to the corporate developers, the foreman had silently stepped away and summoned the authorities. He had recognized the undeniable proof of a federal crime and initiated the final mechanism of the trap. The police cruisers skidded to a halt, forming an impenetrable barricade of steel and flashing lights across the driveway. The heavy doors flew open, and uniformed deputies spilled out into the night, moving with aggressive, practiced efficiency. They immediately smelled the overwhelming toxic odor of the spilled gasoline pouring out from the splintered barn doors. They saw the blinding floodlights and the figure of a man kneeling in the center of the volatile puddle, his hands covering his face in absolute defeat. Shouts echoed across the courtyard, sharp and authoritative, ordering the suspect to keep his hands visible and lower his body completely to the damp earth. Aaron was entirely disoriented by the sudden shift from his frantic arson attempt to the glaring lights and the shouting officers. his cognitive functions completely shattered. He tried to stand up, his expensive leather shoes slipping uncontrollably on the fuel-soaked dirt. The officers did not hesitate for a single second. Recognizing the extreme danger of an uncooperative suspect surrounded by highly flammable liquid, 3 deputies surged through the broken wooden doors. They tackled Aaron hard to the ground, driving the breath from his lungs with a violent grunt. His pristine white dress shirt absorbed the filthy gasoline-soaked mud. An officer swiftly kicked the silver lighter far away into a dark, safe corner of the barn, permanently eliminating the threat of ignition. Heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Aaron's wrists, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. They hauled him up to his feet and marched him out of the barn, pushing him roughly against the cold steel hood of the lead police cruiser. His face was smeared with mud and black grease. His chest heaved with ragged, frantic breaths. He looked wildly around the courtyard, searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. While the officers secured Aaron, a second drama rapidly unfolded on the manicured lawn of the main house. Valerie had watched the entire spectacle from the safety of the stone porch. She saw the arrival of the police, she saw her husband dragged through the dirt, and she understood with terrifying clarity that the syndicate, the lawyers, and the authorities were all converging on them at once. Her dream of endless wealth had mutated into a nightmare of federal prison sentences. Operating on a pure, vicious instinct for self-preservation, she initiated a masterful, instantaneous transformation. She let out a piercing, hysterical sob and stumbled down the wooden steps. She ran directly toward the lead investigator, weeping with a desperate, theatrical intensity. She pulled out her smartphone and shoved the glowing screen directly into the face of the officer. She frantically scrolled through hidden folders of text messages and audio files, actively trading her husband freedom for her own immunity. She pointed a manicured finger at Aaron, screaming that he had forced her into the scheme under the threat of severe physical violence. The facade of their perfect, sophisticated marriage completely disintegrated right there on the front lawn, breaking down into a pathetic display of backstabbing survival. Aaron heard her voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. He twisted his neck, fighting against the firm grip of the deputies holding him. He stared at his wife as she eagerly surrendered every single detail of his criminal conspiracy to the authorities. The betrayal struck him harder than the physical tackle in the barn. He realized that his entire world was aggressively, actively turning against him. He was completely surrounded by enemies. I stepped down from the wooden porch. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my heavy work boots. Every step I took toward the police cruiser felt deliberate and final. The deputies saw me approaching and instinctively parted, forming a narrow path through the flashing red and blue lights. Wyatt stood a few yards away, his arms crossed over his broad chest, keeping a silent, watchful guard. Michael Sullivan remained on the porch, a silent witness to the legal and moral execution of my son. When Aaron saw me approaching, the last remaining traces of his arrogant facade instantly vanished. The slick, wealthy businessman was replaced entirely by a terrified, desperate coward. He abandoned his anger. He abandoned his pride. He began to pull against the grip of the deputies, his voice cracking as he called out to me. Large, ugly tears carved clean tracks through the grime on his face. He begged me to tell the officers it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He pleaded with me to explain that the forged documents were just a catastrophic error in judgment born out of extreme financial stress. He promised he would walk away from Silver Creek and never return if I would only instruct the lawyers to drop the federal charges. When I did not immediately respond, his desperation escalated into frantic emotional manipulation. He invoked the one bond he believed could override his monstrous betrayal. He screamed out into the cold night air, reminding me that he was my flesh and blood. He cried out that he was my only son, and that a loving father could not possibly stand by and watch his own child be sent away to wither in a concrete cell. He begged me to remember the times before the money, before the crushing debt, before the syndicate. He tried to summon the ghost of a relationship that he himself had brutally slaughtered. I stopped precisely 3 feet away from the hood of the cruiser. I stood tall, letting the icy mountain wind wash over my face. I looked down at him, examining the trembling curve of his lip and the panicked sweat mingling with the dirt on his forehead. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal warmth, any flicker of the protective instinct that had driven me to sacrifice my own happiness for his success when he was a child. The reservoir was entirely dry. I spoke to him in a voice so quiet and steady that it effortlessly cut through the noise of the idling engines and the crackling police radios. I asked him if he remembered a rainy Tuesday afternoon exactly 12 years ago. The specific question stopped his frantic weeping. He blinked up at me, momentarily confused by the sudden shift in time. I did not wait for him to answer. I painted the picture for him with slow, deliberate strokes, ensuring the memory would haunt him in his cell. I reminded him of the day the bank officially foreclosed on my commercial construction firm. I had spent 30 years building that company, breaking my back to ensure he had the finest education, the best clothes, and access to the elite social circles he craved. When the economic crash hit, I liquidated my own assets to keep his trust fund completely intact. I reminded him of how I had sat alone on the bare floor of our empty family home, surrounded by cheap cardboard boxes and the ghosts of a ruined lifetime. I had called him that afternoon, begging for a small temporary loan, just enough to secure a tiny apartment so I would not have to sleep in the cab of my truck. I watched Aaron swallow hard as the memory resurrected itself behind his eyes. I continued, keeping my voice entirely devoid of anger. I reminded him of how he had driven up to that empty, foreclosed house in his brand new imported sports car, a vehicle purchased with the very money I had shielded for him. He had walked through the echoing halls of my failure, wearing a bespoke suit and a cruel smile. He did not offer a comforting hug. He did not offer a small loan to keep me off the streets. He had stood in the center of the dusty living room, looked at my packed boxes, and laughed aloud. I recounted every word he had spoken to me that day. I reminded him of how he had looked down at me with supreme, absolute disgust and called me a pathetic failure. He had told me that the world only respected winners and that my financial bankruptcy was a contagious disease he adamantly refused to catch. He had turned his back, walked out the front door, and driven away, leaving his father to freeze in the dark. He had excised me from his wealthy, glamorous life with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a diseased organ. Aaron shook his head wildly, pressing his cheek against the cold chrome of the police car. He babbled rapidly that he had been young and stupid. He claimed he was blinded by his new career and that he deeply, profoundly regretted leaving me in that empty house. He sobbed that people can change, that he had learned his lesson, and that as his father I had a moral obligation to find it in my heart to forgive the sins of the past. I leaned in slightly. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes, ensuring that my final words would brand themselves permanently onto his soul. I told him that forgiveness requires a relationship, and we did not possess one. I spoke with crystal clarity, making certain the arresting officers standing nearby heard every single syllable. I told him that my son died a dozen years ago on the dust-covered floor of an empty, foreclosed house. I explained that the boy I raised had perished the exact moment he decided money was more valuable than the blood in his veins. I stated the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told him that I was not his father, and he was not my flesh and blood. The shivering, broken man handcuffed in front of me was just a desperate, opportunistic thief who had broken into my home to steal from a dead man. Aaron opened his mouth to release a wail of ultimate despair, but the sound died in his throat. He saw the cold, empty truth in my eyes. He realized that the biological safety net he had aggressively counted on was completely, irreversibly severed. The emotional manipulation had failed entirely. He was utterly and profoundly alone in the universe. I did not offer him a parting glance or a final word of comfort. I turned my back on the police cruiser and walked away. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, a steady, uncompromising rhythm of closure. I walked past the flashing blue and red lights, past the officers documenting the active crime scene, and past the shattered doors of the barn. I walked toward the deep, enveloping shadows of the Montana mountains, leaving the thief to face the cold, unforgiving machinery of justice. The heavy tires of the police cruisers crushed the gravel, as they executed a synchronized turn in the wide front courtyard. The flashing red and blue lights swept frantically across the rough bark of the ancient pine trees, painting the dark forest in harsh artificial colors for a fleeting, violent moment. I stood completely still on the edge of the porch and watched the taillights disappear down the long, winding dirt driveway. The piercing wail of the sirens gradually faded into a hollow, distant echo, bouncing off the granite cliffs, until the deep, absolute silence of the Montana night swallowed the sound entirely. The chaotic, frantic energy that had infected Silver Creek for weeks departed permanently with those vehicles. Deep in the eastern tree line, where the shadows were thickest and most impenetrable, I noticed a subtle but definitive shift. The heavy, dark SUVs belonging to the underground syndicate had been idling just beyond the property markers, waiting for the fraudulent wire transfer to hit their accounts. The sudden massive presence of county law enforcement had severed their patience completely. They possessed the sharp survival instincts of seasoned apex predators. They knew the money was gone and the property was now a heavily monitored federal crime scene. I heard the low vibrating rumble of their high-performance engines shifting into gear. They retreated into the darkness, abandoning their posts and vanishing into the unforgiving wilderness without a single word. The immediate physical threat was completely neutralized. The sprawling ranch belonged to the mountains once more. I remained standing on the wide timber porch, letting the crisp, freezing night air wash the sharp scent of gasoline and human fear from my heavy canvas jacket. Wyatt stood beside me perfectly still, resembling a statue carved from the very rock of the valley. He let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of the past miserable month. We did not need to exchange words of congratulation or relief. The victory was vividly evident in the stillness of the air and the solid, unyielding presence of the land beneath our boots. I turned away from the darkness toward the heavy oak front doors of the main house. The thick glass panels reflected the pale silver light of the rising moon. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped over the threshold. Wyatt followed closely behind me, his heavy, deliberate steps grounding the reality of our reclamation. The grand living room was a monument to Aaron and Valerie's spectacular failure. The shredded remains of the corporate transfer contracts littered the polished hardwood floor like dirty, corrupted snow. The empty crystal champagne flutes sat abandoned on the stone hearth. I walked past the debris, ignoring it completely. It was just garbage left behind by arrogant trespassers. The structural integrity of the house, the massive Douglas fir beams, and the towering Riverstone fireplace remained entirely untouched by their shallow, desperate greed. We moved silently through the cavernous hallways, heading straight toward the master suite at the end of the corridor. This was the true heart of Vincent's home, the private sanctuary he had built with his own calloused hands. Aaron and Valerie had invaded it, treating the sacred space like a cheap luxury hotel room. I pushed the heavy bedroom door open and turned on the bright overhead lights. The vast space was choked with the vulgar, superficial trappings of their fabricated wealth. Enormous designer suitcases were half-packed and abandoned on the woven rugs. Silk garments and expensive synthetic fabrics were draped carelessly over Vincent's hand-carved wooden furniture. Dozens of highly branded cosmetic bottles and heavy glass perfume jars cluttered the antique mahogany vanity. I felt a sudden surge of cold, profound disgust. I looked at Wyatt and nodded my head toward the miserable mess. We began the purge immediately. We did not fold their clothes or pack their bags with any semblance of care or respect. We grabbed the expensive designer luggage and shoved the silk garments inside, forcing the gold zippers shut over the bulging fabric. We swept the expensive cosmetics and the shiny jewelry boxes into heavy plastic black garbage bags. Wyatt hoisted 2 massive oversized suitcases onto his broad, muscular shoulders and carried them out to the back service porch. I gathered the remaining bags of their personal trash, dragging them across the hardwood floor and tossing them outside into the freezing night. We stripped the massive king-sized bed of the ridiculous high-thread count sheets Valerie had purchased, tearing them away aggressively to reveal the bare mattress underneath. We worked together with a methodical, punishing physical efficiency until every single trace of their parasitic existence was completely eradicated from the room. Once the room was entirely empty of their poison, we began the quiet process of restoration. I walked to the large cedar storage chest resting at the foot of the bed and opened the heavy wooden lid. The rich, earthy scent of natural cedar and old wool instantly filled the sterile air. I pulled out Vincent's heavy woolen blankets, the thick, durable ones woven by local artisans decades ago. Wyatt took one end, and I took the other. We draped the heavy fabric over the bare mattress, smoothing out the thick wrinkles, restoring the rugged, utilitarian purpose of the sleeping quarters. I walked to the far corner of the room and repositioned the worn brown leather armchair, dragging it firmly back to its rightful place facing the large window that overlooked the eastern cattle pastures. I took Vincent's old brass reading lamp from the top shelf of the closet and set it down heavily on the side table. We placed his favorite leather-bound books regarding local territorial history and soil conservation back onto the floating wooden shelves. The room seemed to breathe a long sigh of relief. The sterile artificial atmosphere of a corporate penthouse was permanently replaced by the warm, authentic soul of a working mountain ranch. I left the master suite and walked down the long, shadowy corridor toward the main kitchen. The natural stone floors felt cool and permanent beneath my heavy boots. I opened the thick, insulated doors of the temperature-controlled pantry. Aaron had consumed a significant and expensive portion of Vincent's liquor cabinet to fuel his escalating panic, but he had lacked the refined, educated palate to recognize the true treasures hidden in the very back shadows. I reached past the flashy commercial bottles and retrieved a dusty, unmarked bottle of dark red wine. Vincent and I had purchased a single case of this specific vintage during a rare trip to the western coast over 20 years ago. We had established a tradition of opening a bottle whenever the ranch survived a particularly brutal winter storm or successfully finalized a difficult cattle drive. It was the literal taste of endurance and survival. I brought the dusty bottle back into the grand living room, where Wyatt was currently sweeping the shredded legal contracts into a metal dustpan. I retrieved 2 heavy crystal glasses from the tall mahogany cabinet. I uncorked the bottle using a simple steel tool, letting the rich, complex aroma of dark fruit and aged oak fill the space between us. I poured the dark liquid into the glasses, measuring 2 generous, equal portions. I walked over to the foreman and held out my hand. Wyatt set the metal dustpan down on the floor and took the glass. His rough, calloused fingers wrapped securely around the delicate crystal. We did not offer a grand cinematic toast or speak unnecessary words. We simply raised our glasses in a silent mutual acknowledgement of the hard, brutal work we had just accomplished together. I took a slow, deep drink, letting the familiar heavy warmth settle deep in my chest. I walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the far wall of the grand living room. I stood in the exact center of the glass, looking out over the vast, sprawling expanse of the Silver Creek Valley. The bright silver light of the full moon illuminated the rolling hills, casting long, sharp black shadows across the frost-covered grass. The creek itself wound smoothly through the center of the valley floor, gleaming brightly like a ribbon of liquid mercury in the darkness. The high timberline stood dark and resolute, acting as a natural, impenetrable fortress, protecting the valley from the corruption of the outside world. The ranch was completely, profoundly silent. It was not the tense, fragile silence of a pending disaster or a ticking clock. It was the deep, absolute structural peace of a kingdom that had successfully expelled its invaders and locked its gates. I watched the freezing wind move through the tops of the tall pines, and I realized the fundamental, unshakable truth of the battle we had just won. Justice is never about loud, chaotic revenge. It is never about screaming matches or physical violence or stooping to the miserable level of the desperate parasites who try to bleed you dry. True, lasting justice is the cold, undeniable, and absolute enforcement of strict boundaries. It is the quiet, methodical execution of the law and the unwavering refusal to ever be a victim. Aaron and Valerie had relied entirely on emotional manipulation, deceit, and loud noise to steal a life they did not earn. I had relied entirely on silence, patience, and ironclad legal preparation. The legacy of my brother was finally undeniably secured. The land would remain whole and protected exactly as he had intended from the very beginning. And as I took another slow sip of the dark red wine, watching the moonlight wash over the eternal mountains, I knew with absolute certainty that my dignity remained entirely permanently untouchable. The greatest lesson learned from this ordeal is that true strength lies not in explosive anger or vengeful retaliation, but in the quiet, meticulous preservation of your boundaries. When manipulators attempt to exploit your past affection or twist your legacy for their own shallow gain, silence and legal preparation become your most impenetrable shields. Enduring profound betrayal from those closest to you requires the painful realization that you must sever toxic ties to protect the foundation of your life. Peace is ultimately secured by standing firm in the truth and allowing the cold mechanics of justice to sweep away the corruption. If this story of calculated justice and unyielding boundaries resonated with you, please share your thoughts below and subscribe for more tales of resilience and redemption.